Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, young people, often just 12 or 13 years old, lurking in the dark corners of society, trapped with no way out. They are America's victims of sex trafficking. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, even our global audience today surprised at the level of which human trafficking, sex trafficking of children happens in the United States.
Exactly. It's interesting that you mentioned that. We got this Facebook comment from Farhan, all the way from Hargeisa, Somaliland, and he says, how could it be possible that a superpower like the U.S., who claims to teach the world good ethics, could have such awful cases of human rights violations? So a lot of surprise there. Now, for those of you at home, we want to know what you think as well. So join the conversation by using the hashtag AJStream.
And with us in studio today is Tina Front. She is the executive director and co-founder of Courtney's House. That is an organization that helps victims escape sex trafficking. Tina herself is a survivor, and in 2010 she was given the Frederick Douglass Award, which goes to those who have survived slavery and are helping others. Tina, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we've got some wonderful guests in our Google Hangout today, some of whom will share their personal stories of being victimized by sex traffickers and how they're now helping others. We're going to introduce you to them in a moment. And of course, you can join us in future Hangouts. Just go to the link below and add us to your circles.
My name is Mike Elgin. I write about technology and culture. I'm a digital nomad, which means I live everywhere, and I'm also in the stream.
They live in the shadows, trapped in a life that many feel they just can't get out of. They are victims of sex trafficking. And although this is a global issue, today we're focusing on the problem here in the United States. The common misperception is that most victims of sex trafficking come from outside the country. But according to the Department of Justice, 83% of trafficked people in the U.S. are American. And perhaps most disturbing is this statistic. As many as 200,000 of the sex workers in the United States are children. So what, if anything, is the U.S. government doing about this? Earlier this month, President Obama signed the Violence Against Women Act, which also reauthorized funding to help victims of sex trafficking.
Today is about young women like Ty, who was brought into the sex trade by a neighbor when she was 12 years old. Ty was rescued with the help of an organization led by trafficking survivors. Today, she's enrolled in college. She's working full-time to help at-risk girls stay out of the sex trade. Couldn't be proud of her.
The president's comments demonstrate a new level of visibility to this issue for many Americans, but also raise the question, is the problem far bigger than people realize? Joining us to discuss this is Stacey Sheehan, Director of the Case Analysis Division at the National Centers for Missing and Exploited Children. She's here in Washington, D.C. In our Hangout, we have Andrea Powell, Executive Director and founder of Fair Girls, which works to prevent the trafficking of young people in the U.S. and around the world. With Thelma T. Ortiz Walker-Pettigrew, a domestic human trafficking advocate and one of Glamour Magazine's 2011 Women of the Year. Brooke Bello is the Executive Director of More to Life. She is a child sex slavery survivor. And Kwame Fosu, Policy Director at the Rebecca Project for Human Rights. We are so glad to have all of you with us today. And Stacey, I want to start with you. I think it's important to frame this issue properly because so many people, Americans, assume that when we're talking about sex trafficking, we're talking about third world countries or we're talking about women and children from third world countries. So how big is the crime of human trafficking in the United States and who are its victims?
It's a question that we get a lot, and it's a good question. The difficulty is there isn't a national estimate at this time of the number of victims in the United States. What we are seeing every day at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is that these are U.S. victims, that these are America's children, and what we're seeing is that they are also missing children. They're runaways. Last year alone, in 2012, 1 out of every 8 runaways that was reported to the National Center was also a possible victim of sex trafficking. And that's only of the cases that we know of. We don't get every report of missing children to the National Center. If every missing child was reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I think the numbers could be even higher.
Tina, give us a sense of how this happens. I mean, you were 9 years old when you were raped.
Right.
And a person listening to that would think it can't get worse than that, and your life actually did. how does a child get into such a position?
Well, I think the number one thing that we don't talk about, that we must talk about, is that these traffickers are pedophiles. And let's just be honest about that. So that means a pedophile raped me at 9 years old, sold me inside of foster care, and then when I was 13, right, I met a man who was 15 years my senior and who was a pimp. Now you would think those situations would kind of put warning signs and signals in you, but it wouldn't. It wouldn't if you never had consensual sex. So I think the important piece is 99.9% of all of our survivors, both male and female, have had consensual sex. They were all molested before their sex trafficking situation even occurred.
So and maybe did you also think you were going from a horrible situation to a better situation?
Actually, the traffickers are tricky. So again, thinking of them as child pedophiles. So this guy, who was 15 years my senior at 13, it was a relationship in my head. I didn't know what a pimp was. Not one situation is the same. So that was a family control situation, dynamic of control. I didn't know what a pimp was. So no, this had to be with gaining my trust. I gave him way too much information. So I told him that I grew up in foster care and that I was adopted. Guess what? He told me he grew up in foster care and that he was adopted. So this is what pedophiles do. They really hatch onto the kids and make up a story that they believe, and then it's easy to manipulate them after that.
And hearing these stories is pretty eye-opening for our community. There's a tweet here from Cynthia who I'd say that most in the U.S. have little idea about sex trafficking worldwide and wouldn't really believe that it's happening here. So we asked our community what could be done. Darby Hickey, a former AJ Stream guest, writes back, focus on the forced labor aspect, not so much just the sex. T, in our hangout, I want to go to you. You're a survivor and you were forced into it at an early age, but you got out at the age of 17. Tell us your story.
A little bit about my story is that I also, like Tina, was raised in the foster care system since birth. And so from the age of basically birth to 10 years old, I endured various different multiple levels of abuse, verbal, sexual, physical, which made me really vulnerable at the age of 10 years old, when I was used to being more mature than my age because of my circumstance, when I befriended a man who promised that he would take care of me and he would love me and he would provide for me and be that constant force in my life. At that time, I had been in over 14 placements and I didn't have any constant figure. And so I, of course, connected with this person unknowing to how he would eventually really shape the rest of my life.
Brooke, this started for you when you were 11 years old. Tell us your story. How did you end up in sex slavery as a child?
Well, after I was raped, the propensity for most traffic victims is a point of brokenness at an early age. So I was a runaway, and I was actually snatched off the street and beat up, put in a bathtub, hung over a balcony, and they said they're going to cut my face up, and they forced me to walk the streets of Los Angeles. I also lived in a brothel and was coerced and seasoned by a madam as well. And it was a very difficult time of my life. I was already broken. My father wasn't in the home. I had already been molested. There was violence in the home. And when you're a little girl, if you have to sort of picture it, when you're a little girl like Tina, 9, and T, very young, and I'm very young, we're just these little skinny kids that never have seen a penis before, don't even understand what sex is. And so when some older man comes and rapes you, it completely shatters who you are psychologically. And then herein lies the quandary of why people don't understand why some victims are still in it at a later age, because at that point of impact you pretty much stop growing in certain aspects of who you are.
And Tina, I think this goes back to something you were saying, that this is about a mindset, and if this is all you've ever known, this is normal to you, right, quote unquote. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so at Courtney's house, the one thing that we definitely do is focus on trauma recovery. And I think it's important that we also understand that I based everything that we do at Courtney's house, all our programs, off of my life and what did not work and what should have. So our support groups are to transition your mindset out of the life, really, because exactly what my survivor sister Brooke and my survivor sister Chi said is true. It is a whole mindset that we have to go back years to understand. That is what those formative age is. So if I'm forming a child at 9, 11, 12 years old and saying this is all you're going to be worth, that's it. That's what men are going to consider. You're going to believe it because all the rape and abuse goes, yes, you're absolutely right. No one is telling you that you're more. And older women that are in this, just like Brooke said, are also putting you into life and telling you that this is what you're supposed to do. Mine was a grandmother who was 72. Brooke also had a madam, and I'm sure T also had a situation where it's older women who are actually conditioning your mind right along with the traffickers.
So, Brooke, you're forced into this life at 11. You never have a chance to define yourself. Is there a moment, maybe as a teenager or as an adult, where you look in the mirror and you realize, I have no idea who I am?
Well, Lisa, you have to understand that a child's mind doesn't develop till they're 24. And there's not a drug or a person that can give you an identity. So when that's lost in the fire and never developed, you're growing up in that and you're becoming what the trafficker and who the trafficker says you are. I remember a point of being in the brothel, completely drugged out. As I told Michael yesterday in the pre-interview, I had never done drugs. I didn't know what it's like to be high. So imagine being raped by a 350-pound fat man. The room was full of smelly men. And then for the first time, you're under the psychoses of our barbiturates and heroin and drugs at the same time. It's profound. But children are resilient. And sometimes you don't really deal with the psychosis until later in life. I remember staring at stucco on the wall in that moment of being completely out of it, thinking if I ever got out of this, if there's children or girls like me anywhere, that I would help girls like me. And of course I was eventually able to do that. But it was years before I was out, because I was out, like Tina said, mentally or physically, but not psychologically. That's been probably in the last 4 or 5 years of my life that I think that I'm really free for the first time.
Andrea Powell, you're the executive director and co-founder of Fair Girls. You deal with a lot of these young girls who are often looked at as criminals and not as victims. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So even though the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in 2000 clearly defines anyone under the age of 18 induced into commercial sex, which could be prostitution or another form of commercial sex, as a victim, oftentimes what plays out in reality, particularly when you have law enforcement or prosecutors who aren't aware of the laws, is that they can be charged with solicitation or prostitution. Furthermore, they can be charged with other crimes related. So, for example, being a runaway here in the District of Columbia, you could be charged with abscondence or truancy. And so you're sending this message to somebody already victimized and brutalized and raped that also you're a criminal, and that just further pushes down their self-esteem. And so we work really hard, not only with survivors and young women and girls getting out of exploitation, but also work to educate law enforcement and other professionals on how they can be a part of the movement and a part of that empowerment process instead of just continuing to degrade victims. And there's a real push right now for a national effort to pass what's called safe harbor laws, which look a little different state to state, but ultimately would ensure that young people under the age of 18 are offered resources and connections to programs like Fair Girls or Courtney's House or other agencies, so that they can get services instead of just being put in detention and left to suffer by themselves.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that. We just got a tweet from Direction who says, in any other sphere, sex with a minor is rape, but not for the victims of trafficking. We process them like criminals, which is basically what you just said, Andrea. But Stacey, there's a Facebook comment here from Mikey that I'd like you to address. He says, I see us talking about the exploitation of little girls, underage girls, but what about boys? Are they lost in the, for lack of a better word, sexism of our understanding of sex trafficking? Stacey?
Yes, I think that when it comes to boys, there's a slight misunderstanding, and there's a little bit of a bias here in terms of, can males in general be victimized sexually? And the answer to that is yes, and there are definitely male victims of sex trafficking here in the United States. Looking at the data that we see at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we're seeing an increase in males in the past couple years and an increase in transgender youth. So I think as law enforcement and prosecutors are becoming more informed, we are going to continue to see more males being identified as victims in this.
Tina, I know you want to jump in here because your organization works with both boys and girls.
We're the only ones in the area that focus on girls and boys as trafficking, who are sex trafficked, yes. In our street outreach, we go on the boy and transgender tracks and always have worked with them out. Definitely now, a lot of police are starting to on the efforts. They have so much to do with girls and haven't. 88% of all our clients, both male and female, identify as LGBTQ. It makes sense to me. We don't get to pick and choose in the life, so the programs have to catch up to that.
T, you wanted to jump in?
I just wanted to follow up and say, definitely, I want to thank the person who put the post on Facebook. That is definitely a relevant issue, that this is not an issue that just is segregated to only young women and girls, but it's also, in my work, in my field, I've mentored over 100 young people getting out of the life, and I've been able to interface with those who have been transgender youth, straight young men who have been trafficked, who've been forced to have sex with older adult male and things like that. And so I think that that's a very relevant point, in that unfortunately we need more programs such as that Tina brings to us to be able to address it, not only for the young victims such as the girls, but also the young men.
Brooke?
Yeah, Tina has helped me design my street outreach here in Florida, which also goes to transgender tracks, where we deal with young men. And I'm really passionate about that, because in the brothel there were boys there that had never been with men before that were being violated. And a lot of them, unfortunately, liked girls, but now are homosexual or gay and really don't want to be. They're just afraid and angry. And most men don't express or share, just like 1 in 4 women, that they were ever raped or violated, and men even more so, especially coming out of the prison system. It's hard for them to say, hey, my daddy raped me, or I was molested, or some guys pinned me down and made me give them a blowjob. It's very difficult for them to share that with anyone. They don't have a safe place to fall.
Kwame Fosu, I want to bring you into the discussion. You're the CFO and the policy director at the Rebecca Research Project. Talk about the role of the internet in sex trafficking and how that has changed the landscape.
Okay. I also wanted to add to that regarding boys who are being abused. We have to understand that, as Tina said, this is an issue of pedophilia. And here in the United States, we just witnessed the Catholic Church paying over $660 million in payouts for raping boys. And when it comes to boys, there is a very deep layer of shame. And the people who are raping these boys most of the time are people who are very powerful, like Jerry Sandowski, who recently went to jail, and they're protected by the establishment. So it's a question of also focusing on prosecuting people who are, like Jerry Sandowski, very powerful people, and also prosecuting the clergy for raping boys who are basically in their care.
All right.
So that's something we have to look.
Got it. All right. So, but in terms of the role of the internet in sex trafficking, since you focus on a lot of internet issues as they pertain to children and sex trafficking, how has that changed things? How has it exacerbated the problem?
Well, recently, Craigslist, a couple of years ago, we were able to get Craigslist to shut down their adult site. And now a lot of advocates are working to shut down Backpage's website. But what happens is that this morphs into some other part of the website. Right. And I think we should look at this more comprehensively and look at the giants who are actually involved in sex trafficking online. Google, if you want to make a comparison, for instance, Backpage makes about $24 million from sex ads. Google AdWords makes a total of $42 billion from all its ads, and probably in the tens of billions with sex ads. So it's a question of focusing and talking about where and how these companies can have policies that actually stop sex traffickers from placing these ads on their websites through identification verification.
Andrea, I want to bring you in because you work on these issues a lot, and the reality is that there are companies like is it I'm forgetting the name of the company? Backpage? Thank you.
Yes, Backpage.
Like Backpage, that they have like a triple layer security system, yet all of these sex traffickers still manage to get on the site. So until there are federal laws that make it very clear that these sort of things are not permitted, what's going to change?
So here's something just to keep in mind, and it's one example, but I think it's a good one. So Backpage.com, previously owned by Village Voice Media, but now independent, has this section, this adult section, specifically the escort section, where supposedly, consenting adults are posting legal ads. But by and large, almost all of the ads are really related to prostitution. And within that, a very large percentage from what we've seen are potentially victims of sex trafficking. In fact, girls as young as 11 in our program have been exploited on this website as well as other websites. And now it's not the internet's fault, but you can't have a house and know there's crimes going on inside of it and not do something about it. Backpage.com's ownership says they screen these ads. But if that's the case, why is it that almost every single day there's an ad here in the DC area that is advertising a girl as a submissive slave? And I don't know how you could be more clear that sex slavery exists on that website than that.
And Andrea, we're getting tweets from people who aren't convinced, as you just said. Guacamole says not a whole lot can be done because traffickers will just find another site and another way. Darby says, yes, shutting down sites like Backpage will just make victims of sex trafficking harder to find. Now, I know at your organization, you scroll through the lists of pages like this to look for girls that are crying out for help, basically, with thinly coded references to barely legal. So
Right.
Would you agree with that? Would shutting down pages like this make them harder to find?
It will reduce the marketplace. So instead of slave owners, which is what traffickers are, using a marketplace and a ship, they're now using internets and hotels. This is the new face of slavery. And in terms of, shutting those sites down, making it harder to find victims, that's fine. We're adaptive. We will go where the problem is and keep going there. So we're trying to make the marketplace smaller, hold businesses accountable, ensure that traffickers are held responsible, and also help girls and boys get services. So this is a problem where we have to stay as adaptive and responsive as the rest of the systems are. And right now, Backpage.com is our biggest online problem, and I'm sure that'll change over time.
And law enforcement is trying to stay adaptive as well. We spoke to a special agent with the FBI who deals with violent crimes against children. He told us about the resources that the FBI has to crack down on sex trafficking.
What I can say is what we've done is we've partnered and established task forces, FBI task forces. We currently have 66 child exploitation task forces operating across the country. And what we do is we partner with state and local partners to create a force multiplier to where not only do we have FBI agents addressing this crime threat, but we're also partnering with our state and locals to get more boots on the ground, if you will, to try to address this crime threat.
So, Andrea, the FBI and other law enforcement are going after these sex traffickers, but in a way, do you feel like they're only scratching the surface?
I have a lot of respect for many of the officers who work with us here in the DC area through the DC Anti-Trafficking Task Force, but that's a very small group of officers, and there are somewhere between 200 and 600 ads on just Backpage.com every day, plus there are situations on the street level, and really, this is a massive problem that law enforcement and NGOs can't fight alone. And it would have been really great if the owners of Backpage.com would have worked with us as opposed to being counterproductive.
Well, Tina, and looking towards what can be done, Pat Gunn on Google Plus says more needs to happen on the city and state levels because it's insufficient. And then he got a response from Zach who says, well, non-federal laws are insufficient. Shouldn't more be done on the federal side? And then one more from Jan who says, shouldn't we look at this as laws against child labor? There's only 30 seconds to answer those questions. We'll go into more in the post show. But.
Well, all great questions, but I think we need to look at it this way. So first of all, federal law contradicts local law.
Right.
And so here in this area, guess what we have? DC, Maryland, Virginia, and county laws. And so with that said, yeah, we have to get more officers and more laws on it, but no one's talking about what we need to do for the demand. That'd be great to hand it on child labor law, but it doesn't even include U.S. and the wording. But what about the demand? So supply and demand.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there. What about the demand and obviously dealing with the perpetrators? We're going to discuss that in the post show. So go to stream.aljazeera.com and we'll continue this conversation. Welcome to the Online Post Show. I'm Lisa Fletcher. I want to get back to our conversation about sex trafficking in the U.S. We have Andrea Powell, Stasis Sheehan, Tina Frunt, T. Brooke Bello, and Kwame Fosu with us. Tina, we were talking as we ended the main program about this issue of supply and demand when it comes to child sex trafficking. Pick up where you left off.
You know, it's very interesting that we, for some reason, leave the pedophiles out of this. Those are the men who purchase sex and buy sex from the boys and girls. And so, no question yet did I hear about the federal laws and local laws on the buyers. So honestly, at Courtney's house, we had to help parents move. We had to help them move because one of the buyers was actually living behind one of our kids' high school. We have to talk to our survivors about what to do if a buyer approaches them because they're afraid of them. And they don't get charged at all.
Why not?
Well, see, the laws are funny that way. And so let's talk about that. Prostitution is illegal. It doesn't say it's illegal if you have sex with a 12-year-old. It just doesn't say that right now. And we should know that, but it doesn't say that. So what actually happens in some of the cases is they do contact the buyers to see if they were involved with the trafficker, to build a case on the trafficker. So that way, that if the buyer gives information on the trafficker, he's let go. And so because he's let go, I say to America, wouldn't you want to know if a buyer was living next door to you?
Buyer's an awful nice way of saying criminal pedophile.
Yeah, you know, and let's call them pedophiles, but let's not call them Johns. And so at Courtney's house, we don't use that word John as a buyer. We don't, because I know people named John and they're nice. We give these buyers beautiful names, right? We give them this nice name. So it takes away the trauma that they actually put on the survivors. And I'm pretty sure Brooke and T can talk about that, because even to this day, yeah, I have people who, I'm in the light and people ask me about traffickers, but they don't ask me about what happens when buyers recognize me and contact me, because nothing ever happened to them, so they do have the audacity.
Well, Brooke, I would like your thoughts on that. And we also have this tweet from Simply Sud, who says there's demand, and hence the traffickers search for supply. They thrive on people's insecurities and poverty. Brooke?
Well, I wanted to add that a lot of unspoken young men who are violated and raped as children, they become traffickers when they're older because they don't have a safe place to fall. Many traffickers and men dealing with a lot of sexual issues in this way were violated as children that slipped through the cracks and never got help. And so it's something that we really have to deal with, going back to what Kwame and Tina was saying earlier about male victims. And what was the question before that? Because I was so passionate about that.
About supply and demand. And are we just giving a slap on the wrist to the buyers, quote unquote, the pedophiles?
Without a doubt. I mean, there's some laws being passed in New York and California, but without a doubt. Johns is a really horrible word, because like Tina said, I know a lot of really great guys named John. But I think that when more men speak out and people begin to understand that sex with a minor is rape, then we'll begin to look at pedophiles in a different light and not lighten that a trafficker is a pedophile, that a pimp is a pedophile, that some men who are into pornography, who don't think they're pedophiles, are operating in pedophilia, because a lot of the women that they're looking at online and in European magazines are actually minors as well. And so we just blow the cap off this whole thing. People are going to realize, wait a minute, you know, I didn't sign up for that. I don't want to go that far down the rabbit hole. And maybe we can begin to really get into the heart of men to deal with that issue as well.
Andrea, what changes to state or federal law would you see as most meaningful?
You know, I think that what's most important is for us right now, and this is sort of shifting the conversation, but it is just a daily issue with us right now, is we need more resources for housing, because we are pretty crafty in working with our survivors to get jobs, to get back into school. And there are a lot of other issues, but really, if there's no place to put your head at night, it's really hard to tell a girl, hey, we're here to help you, we're here to support you, but we don't have anywhere for you to go, not even a hotel room, and that's just not right. If we are this serious about combating modern day slavery, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, we need to talk about funding for housing. That's just a top priority for us right now.
You find yourself in the same position?
Housing, definitely. More resources for parents, parent support groups. There's no housing for boys as a sex trafficking at all. And over 18, for some reason, people want to keep putting up houses, which is awesome for minors. But what happens when they're 18? You know, and then some of our kids just have babies. And so some places don't take kids who just had a baby. So I think there's housing's a need, but long-term services, because after the housing is done and they go home, don't they need services too? So I think we need an assortment of services. We do that with sexual assault. We do that with domestic violence. We don't do that with sex trafficking.
Well, Stacey, in talking more about what can be done, Child Leader Project on Twitter says, what's the role of community awareness of prostitution? How has privacy / none of my business made things worse? And on that, what about stigma? You know, the fact that some people will look at these girls and say, well, they chose that life.
I think community awareness is a good topic to discuss, because as awareness increases that these are victims here in our own backyards, and awareness of that comes power. With that knowledge, you know, we would encourage people to speak up and understand that seeing something, it doesn't have to be 100%, you know, illegal. And I've heard people say that I didn't call the law enforcement because I didn't know if there was anything they could do. Well, it's worth picking up the phone and making a call. You can also contact cybertipline.com or 1-800-THE-LOST and make a report. We support law enforcement efforts nationwide, and we want to make sure that these are getting into the hands of law enforcement so that they can do something about it.
Tia, I know you want to jump in here.
Definitely. I think it also makes us look at the fact that we have to also change the terminology and people to understand it in a real issue in regards to our social structure. I think we label things in regards to what we know it has been previous in the past as far as prostitution, but these are not accurate labels upon these children, because most of the time they're not even of legal age to consent to sex. So how can they be selling something that they don't have the legal right to have? So it also, you know, really we look to society to change the language and these labels that are put onto the victims, because they start to definitely internalize this, and this does affect the quality of life they live afterwards.
Brooke?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the heart that I want people to see that we really shouldn't be here. T's story, my story, Tina Front's story. I was close to death so many times. And people need to understand, I couldn't always speak like this. There is no way that I could have done an interview and shared like this and even had the vernacular, the edit key, the understanding. I mean, I barely could, you know, as intelligent as I realize I am now, because of all that I went through, I had my GED. And I haven't even been to college, but I'm well read, and I've fought tooth and nail to be who I am today. And so when people look at the typical victim or survivor, they need to understand that most of us, many of us, are dead and gone or lost. And when you talk about what a victim looks like, it's really important to understand that if you have a woman out on the street at 22 years old, she may look like she knows what she's doing, and she may even fight you. But she got into that as a baby. And so she doesn't even know who she is now. It's almost like she has a personality disorder. And most doctors will say there'll be levels of psychosis there. And it's peeling back the layers until she begins to know who she is and discovers her identity. So I think we need to have a lot more compassion. And as Andrea said earlier, we need to give people a soft place to fall. My drop-in center opens in May, and I am almost all self-funded. And I made a documentary to help fund it, because there's minimal funds out there for survivor-run programs. And that is a really sad thing, and we're doing everything that we can. But I just wanted for people to really see and understand with passion that we really shouldn't be here. And it's a miracle that we even are.
Beautiful note to end the program on. Our thanks to all of our guests for such candid and powerful discussion. Thank you so much. On tomorrow's program, does President Obama's visit to Israel and the West Bank carry more symbolism than expectation? Palestinians and Israelis join the stream to share their views. Until then, we'll see you online.